Good evening, and welcome back to the Velvet Past. Tonight, there is nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. So settle down into your bed, and let your body grow heavy and warm. Let the day, with all its noise, drift away behind you. Tonight we are going to follow one of the greatest stories the world has ever known. The whole long story of ancient Rome. From a few huts on the muddy hill to the greatest empire of its age, and all the way down again into the quiet of history. It is a story of 1,000 years and more, and you do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to stay awake. Let the words move over you like slow, warm water and drift off whenever you like. I will keep going gently all through the night. Let us begin at the very beginning, by a river, in the soft light of long ago.
Chapter 1.
The 7 Hills. Picture a green and gentle country, in the middle of the long boot of Italy. A slow, muddy river winds through it, called the Tiber, and beside the river rise a cluster of low hills. 7 of them, it was said, their slopes covered in grass and scattered trees. This is where the story starts. Long before there were any marble temples, before there were any roads or armies, there were only these quiet hills above the river, and a few simple villages of shepherds and farmers living among them. The Romans loved to tell a story about how their city began. They said that twin baby brothers named Romulus and Remus were set adrift on the river and washed up on its banks, and there, instead of perishing, they were found and nursed by a she-wolf who kept them warm and safe. When they grew up, so the tale goes, they chose to build a city on the hills where they had been saved. The brothers quarreled over which hill should be the heart of it, and in the end, only one remained. His name was Romulus, and the city he founded took its name from him. He called it Rome. Whether any of that truly happened, no one can say. It is a legend, a story told by firelight and handed down through the years. But somewhere beneath it lies a simple truth, that here, on these 7 hills above the Tiber, a little village slowly grew, and joined with its neighbors, and became a town, and then a city. Imagine it in those earliest days, smoke rising from small round huts, sheep on the hillsides, the river sliding by below, and the whole small world of it settling down each evening into a deep and peaceful quiet. From this gentle beginning, everything else would grow. But that is all still far away. Rest here a while, on the green hills above the water, in the soft light of the very first days of Rome.
Chapter 2. The Age of Kings. For its first long stretch of life, Rome was ruled by kings.
There were 7 of them, the Romans remembered, one after another, over more than 200 years. Some of these kings may be more legend than history, their deeds polished and shaped by later storytellers. But together, they slowly turned the little cluster of villages into a real and growing city. Under the kings, Rome learnt much from its more advanced neighbors, especially a mysterious and gifted people to the north called the Etruscans, who knew how to build in stone, how to drain marshy ground, how to work metal and make fine things. Rome drained the low, wet valley between its hills and paved it, and it became the Forum, the great open square that would be the beating heart of the city for 1,000 years. The Romans built their first temples, dug their first great drains, laid out their first proper streets. The city was taking shape. But the last of the kings, the Romans said, was a cruel and arrogant man, a tyrant who ruled by fear. And at last, the people of Rome grew weary of being ruled by the will of one man. They rose up, and they drove the king and his family out of the city forever. And in that moment, they made a promise to themselves that would shape Rome for the next 500 years. Never again would they be ruled by a king. From now on, they would govern themselves. Rest on that quiet, determined thought as the old age of kings comes to its close, and a new kind of Rome is born in its place.
Chapter 3. The birth of the Republic.
The Romans called their new way of governing the Republic, from words meaning roughly the public thing, the affair of the whole people, rather than the property of a king. In place of one ruler for life, they chose 2 leaders, called consuls, each year. 2, so that neither could grow too powerful and each could check the other. And when their single year was over, they laid down their power and returned to ordinary life. At the center of the republic stood the Senate, a council of the most experienced and respected men of the city, who advised, debated, and guided its affairs. Around them swirled the assemblies of the people, who voted and elected and made their voices heard. It was a careful, tangled, hard-won balance between the powerful few and the ordinary many, and it was never perfectly fair. For much of Rome's history, the great old families held most of the real power, and the common people had to struggle again and again for their rights. But it worked, in its rough way, for a very long time, and the Romans were fiercely proud of it. They believed, deep in their bones, that no man should be above the law, and that power shared and passed along was safer than power held in a single hand. This new republic was tough, patient, and stubborn. Its citizens were farmers and soldiers, serious and practical people who valued duty and discipline and loyalty to Rome above all things. They did not yet dream of ruling the world. They only wanted to protect their city and their fields. But a city with such discipline, such stubbornness, and such a talent for war would not stay small for long. Slowly, almost without meaning to, Rome began to grow. Chapter 4. The city grows. At first, Rome fought simply to survive and to master the lands nearest to home. It battled the other peoples of Italy, hill tribes and rival cities, some of them older and grander than Rome itself. And Rome lost battles, sometimes terrible ones. Once, an army of raiders from the north even broke into the city and burned much of it. But this was the thing about the Romans, the quality that would define them for 1,000 years. They did not give up. They could lose a battle, and another, and still come back, patient and grim, until at last they won. And as Rome conquered its neighbors, it did something clever and unusual. It did not simply crush them and enslave them. Often, it offered them a kind of partnership, a share in time in being Roman. Defeated peoples became allies, and then, eventually, citizens. This meant that with each new people Rome absorbed, it grew not only larger, but stronger, gaining more soldiers, more farmers, more loyalty. Slowly, city by city, valley by valley, the whole long peninsula of Italy came under Rome's leadership. To hold all this together, the Romans built. They built roads, straight, solid, stone-paved roads that ran for miles across the land, so that armies and messages and trade could move swiftly from one end of their world to the other. Some of those roads are still there today, 2,000 years later, still running arrow straight across the Italian countryside. And they built their legions, the disciplined, well-drilled ranks of citizen soldiers that would become the most formidable fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. By now, Rome was master of all Italy. And a city that ruled all of Italy could not help but look out, at last, across the sea, where it would find, waiting for it, the greatest rival it would ever face. Chapter 5. The Great Rival, Carthage. Across the sea, on the coast of North Africa, stood a magnificent and wealthy city called Carthage. It was older than Rome, and richer. A city of merchants and sailors whose ships ruled the western Mediterranean and carried goods to every shore. For a long time, Rome and Carthage had little reason to quarrel. But as Rome grew and looked outward, and Carthage guarded its trade, the two great powers came, at last, into a long and bitter rivalry. A series of wars that would decide who would rule the whole Western world. The struggle went on, with pauses, for more than 100 years, and it brought forth one of the most famous figures of all antiquity, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal. He was a brilliant and daring commander, and he conceived a plan so bold that it still astonishes us. Rather than sail against Rome, he marched an entire army, foot soldiers, cavalry, and even war elephants, overland, across mountains and rivers, and over the high, snow-bound passes of the Alps, to fall upon Italy from the north, where Rome least expected him. And for years Hannibal roamed Italy, undefeated, winning victory after victory, shattering every Roman army sent against him, in battles so terrible that the memory of them chilled Roman hearts for generations. It seemed for a while that Rome itself might fall, but Rome, as ever, would not break. It refused to surrender. It raised new armies, and more, and it wore Hannibal down, and at last it carried the war across the sea to the gates of Carthage itself, and forced him home to defend his own city. There, in the end, Hannibal was defeated, and in time, Carthage was defeated utterly. Rome was now, without question, the master of the Western Sea.
Chapter 6. Masters of the Sea. With Carthage broken, there was no power left in the whole Mediterranean that could stand against Rome. And so, over the following century, Rome turned its legions east and west and reached out in every direction. It conquered the wealthy, ancient kingdoms of the Greek world, absorbing their cities and their treasures. It took Spain with its silver mines. It pushed into the lands of the east, toward the old realms that Alexander's heirs had ruled. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, fell under Roman power or Roman influence. The Mediterranean, that great sea at the center of their world, the Romans came to call, simply and proudly, Mare Nostrum, our sea. Rome grew immensely rich on all these conquests. Gold and silver and grain and works of art flowed into the city from across the world. The old Roman farmers who had once fought Rome's wars came home to find their small farms swallowed up by the vast estates of the wealthy, worked now by the countless enslaved people that the conquests had brought. The city swelled with people, with riches, with beautiful things looted from 100 captured cities. Rome was no longer a modest town of shepherds. It was becoming the capital of the world. But all this wealth and power came at a hidden cost. The old, simple republic, designed for a small city of citizen farmers, was now straining to govern an empire that stretched across 3 continents. The gap between the rich and the poor grew into a chasm. Ambitious generals, commanding huge armies loyal to them personally, grew mightier than the Senate that was supposed to control them. The old balance that had held Rome together for centuries was beginning, quietly, to crack. And in the long, troubled years that followed, Rome would nearly tear itself apart. Chapter 7. The Republic strains. For the last 100 years of the Republic, Rome was rich beyond measure and troubled beyond peace. The problems were everywhere. The common people of the city, many of them poor and landless, grew restless and angry. Well-meaning reformers who tried to help them, sharing out land, easing their burdens, made powerful enemies among the wealthy, and some of them were murdered for it, cut down in the streets of Rome itself. For the first time in centuries, Romans were killing Romans over the future of their city. Worse still were the great generals. Rome's armies were now professional soldiers who served for years and looked to their commanders, not to the Senate, for their pay and their land and their loyalty. This meant that a general with a devoted army had become something very dangerous. A man who could, if he chose, turn that army against Rome itself. And some of them did. The last century of the Republic was torn by civil wars, as one great strong man after another marched on Rome, seized power by force, ruled for a time, and fell. It was a violent, exhausting, frightening age, but also a brilliant one, full of dazzling talents and towering figures. And out of all its turmoil, one man was rising, cleverer and bolder and more ambitious than any who had come before. He would win the love of the common people and the fear of the Senate. He would conquer whole new lands for Rome. He would, in the end, break the old republic forever and change the course of the world. His name has echoed down all the centuries since. His name was Caesar. Chapter 8. Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar was a Roman like no other. Brilliant, charming, fearless, and endlessly ambitious. He was a gifted speaker, a shrewd politician, and, as it turned out, one of the greatest generals the world has ever seen. He rose through the ranks of Roman politics, winning the devotion of the common people, and then he went north, into the wild and unconquered land the Romans called Gaul, the country we now call France, and over some years of hard campaigning, he conquered the whole of it, adding a vast new territory to Rome and winning for himself an army that loved him utterly. His enemies in the Senate, watching his fame and power grow, became afraid. They ordered him to give up his army and come home as an ordinary citizen, knowing that, unprotected, he could be destroyed. Caesar came to a river in the north of Italy, called the Rubicon, which marked the boundary a general was forbidden to cross with his soldiers. He paused there, on the bank, and he knew that to cross it meant civil war, and to turn back meant ruin. And then he crossed. "The die is cast," he is said to have murmured. "The dice are thrown. There is no going back now." And with that step, the Republic's long death began. Caesar swept his enemies before him, and in a few years he stood as master of the entire Roman world. He was made dictator, not for a single crisis, as in the old days, but for life. He held more power than any Roman since the ancient kings. He used it, in many ways, wisely and generously. He reformed the calendar, relieved debts, planned great works, and forgave many of his old enemies. But to a proud circle of senators, one thing was unbearable. It looked as though Rome, after 500 years, had a king again in all but name. And so, on a spring day in the Senate itself, a group of them surrounded him with hidden daggers and struck him down. He fell at the foot of a statue, pierced by many wounds. The most powerful man in the world was dead, killed by his own countrymen on the Ides of March. Chapter 9. The First Emperor. The men who killed Caesar believed they were saving the Republic. In truth, they had destroyed it. His murder did not bring back the old freedom. It only plunged Rome into yet another round of terrible civil wars. And out of those final wars there emerged, at last, not a champion of the Republic, but its quiet undertaker, Caesar's own young heir and adopted son, a cool, patient, and extraordinarily clever man named Octavian. Octavian defeated all his rivals, one by one, over long years, until at last, like his adoptive father before him, he stood alone as master of the Roman world. But he had learned from Caesar's death. He did not call himself king or dictator or lord. He was far too wise for that. Instead, he claimed, modestly, to be merely the first citizen, restoring the Republic, serving the Senate and the people. He kept the old names, the old offices, the old comfortable forms, while quietly holding all the real power himself. The Senate, grateful and relieved that the wars were over, gave him a new and honored name, by which we know him still, Augustus, the revered one. He was, in all but title, the first Roman emperor, and under Augustus, the exhausted Roman world at last found peace. After a century of civil war and turmoil, the fighting stopped. The doors of the Temple of War, which stood open in times of conflict, were closed. Augustus ruled for more than 40 years, and he found Rome, as he liked to say, a city of brick, and left it a city of marble. He brought order and stability and a long, deep calm across the whole vast empire, a peace so famous that it has its own name, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the next 200 years, most of the known Western world would live within one great state, under one law, at peace. Rest now in that long calm as the age of the emperors begins. Chapter 10. The Eternal City. Let us pause here, in the heart of that long peace, and simply walk for a while through the great city of Rome at the height of its glory, for there was never anything quite like it. More than 1 million people lived here, packed together from every corner of the known world. Romans and Greeks and Egyptians and Africans and Gauls, speaking 100 languages, worshipping 100 gods, all gathered in the one enormous, roaring, magnificent city at the center of everything. Walk with me, slowly, through its streets in the golden evening light. Here is the Forum, the great open heart of the city, ringed with gleaming temples and law courts and monuments, where senators debate and merchants bargain and crowds gather to hear the news.
Here rise the great public baths, vast halls of marble and warm water, where Romans of every rank come each day to bathe and talk and rest. Here run the aqueducts, those miraculous bridges of stone that carry fresh water into the city from the distant hills, mile after mile, arch after arch. And here stands the greatest of all, the Colosseum, the vast oval arena, tall as a hill, where tens of thousands of people gathered to watch the games.
At the end of the day, the great city slowly settles. The crowds thin. The shops close their shutters. Lamps are lit in 100,000 windows. The last carts rumble through the narrow streets. Far above, on the hills, the temples and palaces glow in the last of the light, and then fade into blue evening. And over it all, over the whole enormous sleeping city, the stars come out. The same stars that had shone on the little village of shepherds 1,000 years before. Rest here, in the heart of Rome, in the quiet of the evening, at the very summit of its long story.
Chapter 11. The Height of Empire. For about 200 years, through the long peace that Augustus had begun, the Roman Empire reached its greatest height. It stretched from the cool, misty hills of Britain in the north to the hot deserts of Egypt and Arabia in the south, from the Atlantic shores of Spain in the west to the great rivers of the Middle East. Millions upon millions of people, of every land and tongue, lived their whole lives within it, protected by its legions, connected by its roads, and governed by its law. There came, in the middle of this age, a run of wise and capable emperors, remembered ever after as some of the best rulers the world had known. Under them, the empire was calm, prosperous, and well-governed. A traveler in those years could set out from Rome and journey for thousands of miles, across the whole span of the known world, using a single language of trade, spending a single coinage, walking on well-kept Roman roads, sleeping safe under the same Roman peace the entire way. It was a kind of unity the Western world would not see again for many, many centuries. This was the golden noon of Rome, vast, peaceful, confident, seemingly eternal. The people of that age could scarcely have imagined that it might ever end. The empire felt as fixed and permanent as the hills themselves. And yet, as with all things, the noon could not last forever. Slowly, so slowly that at first almost no one noticed, the long afternoon of Rome was beginning, and the light, imperceptibly, had started to change. Let us follow it, gently, down toward evening. Chapter 12. Cracks in the marble. The troubles, when they came from many directions at once. Along the empire's vast, distant frontiers, new and restless peoples pressed against the borders, testing the legions, raiding across the rivers. Far to the east, a powerful rival empire challenged Rome for its eastern lands. Holding such enormous borders, year after year, strained the empire's strength and its treasury to the limit. And within, the old sickness returned. The peaceful, orderly handing on of power broke down. Emperors were made and unmade by the armies. Some ruled only months before being murdered and replaced. In one dreadful stretch of years, the empire nearly came apart entirely, torn by civil war, invasion, plague, and ruin all at once. That it survived at all is remarkable. And it did survive, pulled back from the edge by a series of hard, determined soldier emperors who fought to hold the whole vast structure together by sheer force of will. To govern something so enormous and so troubled, one of these emperors made a fateful decision. The empire had simply grown too large for a single man to rule. And so it was divided, an eastern half and a western half, each with its own ruler, its own court, its own capital. The two halves would drift, over the coming generations, further and further apart. And a new capital rose in the east, a magnificent new city by the water that would one day outshine Rome itself. The old city on the seven hills was no longer even the true center of its own empire. The long sunset had begun in earnest. Chapter 13. The long sunset. The end of the Western Empire did not come as a single great catastrophe, a city falling in a day. It came slowly,
like the fading of a long afternoon into dusk, so gradually that many who lived through it hardly knew it was happening. Over many decades, the western half of the empire grew weaker, poorer, and thinner. Its borders could no longer be held. Whole peoples, pushed from their homes far to the east, moved into the empire's lands, sometimes as invaders, but often as settlers, seeking safety, seeking a place to live within the Roman world. More and more, the Western Empire came to rely on these newcomers, even to fill its own armies, until the line between Roman and outsider blurred and faded away. Power drained from the old city of Rome to the frontier generals and the settled peoples who now held the real strength. The emperors in the West became shadows, young, weak, and short-lived, ruling little more than the ground beneath their own feet. And one day, almost quietly, the last of them, a boy who happened to bear the name of the city's legendary founder, was simply set aside. There was no great battle, no burning of the city. The office of Western Emperor simply came to an end, and no one troubled to fill it again. And so, after 1200 years, the Western Roman Empire was gone. But notice how gently the ending came, not with fire and ruin, but with a slow softening, a quiet fading, the way a lamp burns lower and lower, and at last, without a sound, goes out. The cities remained, the people remained, the fields were still farmed, and the old roads still ran across the land. Only the great structure that had held them all together had quietly dissolved into the evening. In the east, meanwhile, the other half of the empire lived on, and would endure for another 1,000 years. Rome did not so much fall as fade and change, and pass its long inheritance onto the world that came after.